cooperative relations between the Polish people and Polish nonprofit organizations and leaders and Ukrainians, and how these civil society organizations are navigating the current refugee crisis and some of the other issues that are hitting Central Europe. And we're pleased to introduce Dr. Jakub Kościółek. And Jakub, thank you so much for being patient with my poor pronunciation of your name. He is the president of the board of Interkulturalni PL. And Jakub is going to describe some of the work that he has done. Jakub, thank you so much for helping us out here to understand your situation and your services.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
So, Jakub, could you talk a little bit about the origins of your organization and its services? And please switch to Polish. I am sorry that I don't possess the language, but Jan is helping us out. So please describe how you and your team founded the organization and the services that you provide.
I represent the organization which is called Interkulturalni.pl, and we were established in Kraków in the year 2010. And this was triggered by the fact that we noticed the need to support migrants, because already back then we saw that there was an increasing number of persons from Ukraine, migrants who were settling in Kraków, so in our city. And we looked at our aim was to tell the city, so all the city authorities and organizations and institutions, that we're talking here about equal citizens who may have some specific needs. What we did is we run some monitoring, looking at how exactly the various agencies of the city were coping with migrants, and based on that, we made certain recommendations. We also run a number of study visits to other European cities to see how they did that, and based on that, we developed a plan on how to best integrate the migrant citizens into the city. And we were the first, Kraków was the first Polish city to have such a plan. Now it so happens that most of our members are members of the academia. They are related to education and higher education and researchers, and we noticed that there was a certain gap in the knowledge of how to work with especially children of migrants, how to what to do at schools, how to make the school more international. So right now we are running two programs which have the aim to integrate kids mainly in the school, but also in other institutions, and to look at it very holistically. So we are developing solutions. We're developing handbooks. These are addressed also at the kids, so Ukrainian and Polish kids, to make the institutions that the children are dealing with more international, more open.
Culture is a continuum, right? So that culture is an exchange. It is bi-directional, multi-directional. So I think that what you're saying is that these influences of history cannot be placed in little buckets with one culture or one group of people or one geography dominating another. And so this theory that Putin has espoused of a dominant narrative that is owned by a particular group in a particular place, it's not correct. It's really a dialogue in which culture is shared. And I think that the Polish people, the Ukrainian people, and even the Russian people, if instead of trying to dominate one another, we instead do what you're doing, which is to strengthen civil society and figuring out ways to talk with each other, you end up with a better world and more prosperity for each of those involved. So we're going to unpack some of your work, because I think that your work can be talked about in a crisis sense, but it could also be talked about in a continuum of history. And I really admire what you are doing.
Tak, ja się w pełni tutaj zgadzam.
I would very much agree with that, in the sense that the exchange between Poland and Ukraine has been going on for hundreds of years. In Kraków, we were organizing an event which was called Following in the Footsteps of Ukrainian writers and artists, because there were quite a number of those who worked and lived at least portion of the time in Kraków, and the same goes for Lviv, where there were quite a lot of Polish writers and painters. With Russians, I am not so sure, because they have lived for centuries in the tradition, in the traditional belief that they are the dominant culture, and their idea is to consciously disparage or diminish such cultures which in their opinion constitute part of Russia or part of Russian culture. And they've been doing that to the Ukrainians for quite a long time. There was Russification. This is a word that is used to express this. For instance, forcing Ukrainians to use the Russian language. And in the 60s, there's this phenomenon which is called the shot generation or executed generation. The generation in the 1960s that were under pressure not to express Ukrainian identity. So there is this vision where the Russians believe, or there is a narrative that very strong, that expresses the belief that Ukraine does not have the right to exist as a cultural identity and does not have the right to exist as a territory. It is perceived from that point of view from Russia as just part of Russian culture and Russian state.
I believe that this is a very human thing. And what I mean by that is cultural chauvinism, whether it's Europeans to the African nations where Europe colonized the African nations, or the colonization of the United States by Europeans, or whether it is the Japanese or the Han Chinese attitudes towards other ethnic groups. We see this constantly in us, in people. And I think that us all have to understand our tendency toward being chauvinistic to others and to build bridges like you are doing.
Tak, zdecydowanie.
I would say yes, very much so. There were some examples of colonialism, and it has to be said that in the 90s in Ukraine, there was, among the writers and thinkers, there was this idea that they would need to perceive Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian country, both as post-colonial, really, as post-colonial to the Russian Empire. And the writers and especially thinkers, intellectuals in Ukraine very quickly realized that they need to focus on renewing, as it were, the Ukrainian identity through culture, among other ways. The Ukrainians at that time, I'm talking about the 1990s, witnessed some support from the West, notably Poland and Germany. So those who were creative in the areas of literature, for instance, could find some sort of window to the West, some sort of valuation, some sort of place where they could exist outside the area of the formerly colonized place. So this was their window to the world, and the Russian culture was very dominant. It was in Ukraine. It was. It functioned as you could see the renewal very quickly in cinema and literature. I would back in early 2000s when I visited. That was before this renewal started to gain momentum, I visited Kyiv, and in the capital of Ukraine, it was actually very difficult to find a bookstore that would sell books written in the Ukrainian language. So this has changed tremendously right now, and this change was parallel with the shift from it's similar to a post-colonial process where the Ukrainians learned to believe that their cultures, because we have the Ukrainians and we have the rest of the world, but they also kind of were in many ways believing that their culture was not on a par. And this is when they found out that yes, it is equal as culture. This is the movement that really started in the 1990s.
This is you are making a fantastic point, Jakub, because when you look at that in that sense, the embrace of communication with the West is less about the West and more about finding an equilibrium so that Ukrainians have space to define themselves, isn't it?
Before I go into details, I'd like to say that as we focus on the exchange and the integration, focusing on children, but of course holistically, so we include the families that the children are in. But we have to keep in mind that the Ukrainian migrants have been the largest group of migrants in Poland for quite some time. And what we have to, we had time to think about it. We need to keep any work with them on equal terms. When the large influx of Ukrainians started long ago, and it was mainly young people, there was immediately some fear that that could lead to serious brain drain. So it is essential, and we put a lot of emphasis on this, that and we have to make everyone aware of that it has to be made on equal terms, so that we don't have situations where Ukrainians, for instance, have unequal labor relations, that maybe they're paid less, and the important thing is that we should integrate and not assimilate. Because if we do not do that, we have to keep it in mind. We have to make sure everyone, also at political levels, keep that in mind. Because if we don't, we have to let them keep their own voice and let them at all times be able to decide about themselves. Otherwise, if we don't, that could lead in the future soon enough to conflicts.
Well, again, you're making an excellent point, right? It's shared prosperity, it's shared respect, it's shared strength. You don't wish to extract knowledge and capability from Ukraine. You want to share the knowledge that you have with Ukraine and the knowledge Ukrainians have with you, so that there is a balance and mutual prosperity that benefits each other, rather than a colonialist attitude, which can result in conflict. You could also have Polish labor becoming very upset with having jobs taken by Ukrainian labor if there is an imbalance, and you are safeguarding against that by assuring that there is no necessarily imbalanced advantage just because somebody is a refugee or somebody is coming from another country. You're finding a way to not only modernize the relationships across borders, but also to find a way to productively deal with the realities of migration and trade and exchange. It's a very important piece of work that benefits not only Ukraine, but also Poland and all of Europe. Now with the refugee crisis, it's taken on another complexion.
When the war broke out, we decided to immediately become involved, and we had a certain experience and certain tools to deal with. We have to also keep in mind that Kraków together with Warsaw, were the largest destinations for the influx of in this case, refugees from the war. We decided to do something real, and because of the experience, we managed to be quite effective. Already on the 24th of February, we decided to establish, together with about a dozen other organizations, mainly NGOs, the Open Kraków Coalition, which is a grouping of organizations which has now more than 60 members. So this is how it started. Also, what needs to be noted was that this was a coalition of organizations which were very diverse. So one thing that we managed to successfully do was to very quickly realize who's good at what. We very quickly were able to find out what needs to be done and who would be the best organization to deal with that. So, for instance, the moment the influx started, we were responding because this was these are huge numbers of people. There was very quickly, and we organized a response group located at the railway station, Kraków Main, which was like the main focal point of arrival. So the very first, the way we worked, we divided our organizations into subgroups. So there was one subgroup which focused on the physical reaction and meeting the arrivals, and these were very basic things. It was providing accommodation and food. Another subgroup was focusing on providing psychological assistance. Another subgroup was focusing on providing legal assistance. There was another subgroup which was formed not long ago, which was the relocation policy. I was, by the way, the coordinator of that subgroup, and this proved to be a very difficult subject to deal with, because on the one hand side, there were a number of cities and organizations throughout Europe which declared that they were willing to accept and host Ukrainian migrants. But from what we've observed, a very large number of the refugees are not willing to relocate. They want to stay close to home, if possible. Many of them believe that the conflict is not going to last long, and if so, they would like to return home as quickly as possible. Another set of activities is related to the education, because Ukrainian children, who arrived in huge numbers, became part of the Polish educational system. So our activities were then focused on improving the way they function within that system. Us being a grassroots movement allowed us to react very fast, but it has to be emphasized that we had at all times good cooperation with the city of Kraków and all of its agencies. That, thanks to fast reaction and to good work with the city authorities, we managed to avoid a humanitarian crisis. The moment huge numbers started arriving, we have to also emphasize that the individual citizens of Kraków played a very significant role, because especially early on they were simply providing shelter to migrants. They were accepting them in their homes, and it has to be emphasized that without the help of individuals, of the inhabitants of Kraków, who provided immediate shelter, we wouldn't have been able to do this. This is one of the few large-scale migrant situations where we managed without building camps, as it were. We did have reception points, but the vast majority of the people who arrived found initial place to stay in people's homes. So given the total number of people who arrived, all the hostels and hotels and the dormitories would not be enough to house that many people.
It's barely comprehensible to Americans. Krakow's population increased by 10%. It would be as if in New York or population increased by 1 million people over, in a very short period of time. The same thing for Los Angeles or any other American city. And we have our own difficulties with migration. It is wholly admirable what has been done. How does, and I know that a lot of this is about volunteering and people spending their own time and even their own money to help others. But you also need some funds to help you coordinate this effort. How does the money work? Where are you funded from?
To znaczy początkowo myślę, że
Well, initially, that is all true. Initially, no one had any money. It was just volunteers and commitment of regular people. The response was tremendous. There were collections, money was collected, things were collected. We had a point like a collection point at one of the largest stadiums in Kraków, and the number of the amount of things that people brought was huge. Nobody expected that. It was actually quite surprising. Well, also no one was expecting such an influx of migrants, but the reaction was tremendous. And it was actually possible in the initial period to operate without external funding. However, I'm a realist, and everybody knows that in a situation such as this, there's a crisis, there's tremendous interest, the emotions run high, and there's a lot of help. But as time goes, the interest will wane, and there will be less involvement and engagement. So the challenge is, how do we continue? And here I have to say that we've had quite a lot of help from international organizations, foundations, either indirectly, so money would be sent to the city of Kraków, and the city of Kraków would then redistribute it to NGOs, or some NGOs received funding from abroad directly. So I have to say that the international community reacted quite strongly and very positively. And our organization as such does not collect money, but I know that many of our members do have such sources of funding. They receive funding from abroad.
It is all about human beings responding to human need. And the funding is all going to civil society. It's not going to perpetuate war. It's basically to respond to human need. It is very admirable. And I'd like to thank you for sharing your experience with us, and to thank also all of the people who are supporting you, because your struggle and your contribution is really as a representative for us all. We should all be doing more, and perhaps can in the future contribute in some small way to your efforts. Thank you so much, Dr. Jakub Kościółek. Please thank all of your volunteers, all of your funders, your entire network for supporting these people in need. And thank you, as an American thanking a Pole, for all the work that you are doing on the behalf of civil society. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I will surely pass on your thanks to all the volunteers and to all the persons who are involved in this. For me, I think it's very important, and that follows from the fact that we had this meeting, that there are people who are willing to talk to us about this, who are willing to talk to people who are doing something positive about that. And it's also very important for US citizens to know about this, especially the US citizens, because the US is a country very close to me, because I was a Fulbright student in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you so much. We can learn from your example, and we very much appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Take care.